Welcome back to the show, everybody. And this is a particularly fascinating episode for me. As many of you that have been following the show for the past several years, you've noticed that I have been a long-term student of Dr. David Hawkins and power versus force and the map of consciousness. And I've been really fascinated by all of that, and I've integrated into my life in many ways. To me, the conscious field that we are living in impacts everything. Impacts our health. It impacts the way that we perceive the world. It impacts and influences the way we interact with other people and how we see everything, different events, everything. And so to be able to live in higher fields of consciousness can make a dramatic impact on the quality of our life. And what our guest today, Jeffrey and Clayten, the founders of Focus Life Force Energy, have been able to develop is this technology that literally can create high conscious fields around your business, around your home, around a cell phone, or just about any object that you choose. And so you are literally can be bathing in a higher field of consciousness. And when I say higher field, this dictates often how we feel. So the fields that they're putting around these spaces can be anywhere from about 550 up to about 600. And you can actually gauge it accordingly to where you want it. But what that means is that the backdrop of that field is a very high consciousness field, which usually helps to buffer a lot of other situations that you can be going through in the world. To me right now, when I feel like we are bombarded by so much that is outside of our perceived senses, whether that's EMF, whether that's radio waves, whether that's thought forms or emotions from other people, all of these things enter our field and can affect us. I want to have layers of mitigation to those things around. So part of that is me building my own level of consciousness, and at the same point creating an environment that is more hospitable and I think can create some frequency immunity to these things. Some of the research that they've done, and they've actually done a fair bit of research, which is really fascinating for this type of technology, is they've seen some dramatic changes in EMF sensitivity. So symptoms like brain fog and anxiety and depression, sleep, a lot of these things. I know Taya, when we did our 15-day free trial, we actually found that Taya particularly had a lot less headaches that went down, and her sleep dramatically improved. We also found that a hornet's nest that kept coming into an area of the house stopped coming there and has not come back. So some of these things are really fascinating to even start to subjectively go through and objectively look to see what changes are taking place when you start this process up and create these high frequency or these high consciousness fields around your property, your phone, your business, etc. So this episode, we get into a lot of fascinating stuff. We look at the research on EMF and some of those pieces. We look at the history of consciousness on the planet, and we look at where consciousness is right now. And we take a look at the events of over the past few years and how that has impacted consciousness on the planet right now. And I'll give you a hint, it wasn't necessarily in a beneficial direction. But how do we use that and now catapult ourselves into a world that we are wanting to create? That's the whole purpose of this series. So if you click the link below, Jeffrey and Clayten are offering everybody a 15-day free trial, and I would implore everybody to give this a try. You don't need a credit card, you don't need any other information, just start the process up and get these high powerful fields of consciousness around your property for 15 days, and then you can switch over and do it around your phone. Look to see if you notice any subtle changes. What do you have to lose? Right now, like I said, add layers of mitigation so that you are dealing with a lot of this unseen in our absolute reality that we're not aware of that actually impacts us. We talk in this episode about how sometimes just emotions, we can be feeling all sorts of things and interacting with our kids or loved ones in a specific way, and it's not even actually us so much as it's things that are agitating our nervous system. I found the same thing when I work with people for mental health and I'm looking for biochemical imbalances. People can have a biochemical sensitivity that's triggering them to feel a certain way that's not really them. They're being triggered in a certain way. This can be the same thing that can come from EMF or from a number of other ways that we can be sensitive and susceptible to. If you click the link, it'll take you to where you can see when they talk about quantum association and how that works. And then you can come right down and click on the free trials. Give it a try. One of them is for your mobile phone. One of them is for your property. They put a very powerful field of around 570, I think upwards to about 600. that is in the area of unconditional lovingness. And so that's the field that you've got sort of as a backdrop to rely on and to kind of bounce off of. I just find in general, when you have that there, you deal with everything else a little bit better and a little bit easier. I find even like with our kids, they bounce back a little faster. It's sort of like it's another additional layer of support. So check that link out, give it a try, and let me know what you notice. This is an area I'm really fascinated by, and my PhD thesis is going to be in this sort of world of looking at this types of whether it's scalar technology or how this sort of subtle energies influence us. And I'm really curious to see what people find. So check it out. Link is below. It's 15-day free trial with nothing really that's required. So give that a try and then just let us know. Send in messages, respond back to YouTube, send us an email. I really want to hear if you guys notice anything. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode as much as we did doing it. And I look forward to talking to you guys soon. Take care. Welcome back to the show, everybody. Thanks for joining us for another episode on the Inspire Health podcast. We are continuing on with our series on creating New Earth, a collaborative mission. And today we have, I think this is going to be a really fascinating interview. This ties in with work that was done by one of my oldest teachers, Dr. David Hawkins, for a long time. So I find this work really fascinating and incredibly beneficial. And we're going to be talking to Jeffrey Stegman and Clayten Stedman. And they are the founders of a company called Focus Life Force Energy, or FLFE Innovations Corporation. And FLFE Innovations has developed a technology that activates a high consciousness field, which can be applied to a home, to a business, to a cell phone, or any personal object. And they're still researching even other ways to create these fields to support humanity and to help raise our level of consciousness. So guys, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Great to be with you.
Thank you, Jason and Taya.
Yeah, great to see you, Jeffrey. Great to see you, Clayten. When we had our chat before the actual interview, we were buzzing for a while after, just talking about all the different ways of how this can be beneficial and just the kind of doors that it actually opens up. This idea that we can actually create a higher frequency field around our homes or our businesses or objects, and then keep that with us. Maybe we can jump in for people that aren't so familiar with what we're talking about from a high consciousness field, or they're not familiar with the work of Dr. David Hawkins. Let me pass it back to you guys to maybe just give us an overview of what is Focus Life Force Energy, and how did you guys come to actually be able to even figure out how to innovate this and start to bring it to humanity?
Well, I'll start. We'd found an inventor, or a group of inventors by the time I met it. It was one who were working on a technology to initially generate electricity, like free energy for humanity. And they had such a high intent towards humanity. They were really just wanted to assist humanity in this time. But and maybe because of their intent, but they created a way to focus energy, but it was life force energy, chi, prana, more of a subtle energy. And while it couldn't generate electricity, it did create this very highly energetic space in this system, which was stacks of coils and plates, originally electrically alternating current running through the whole every stack, not needed anymore the way that we're currently doing it. But this kind of pulling in from the available energy and then concentrating it into one space created an effect that wasn't anticipated, that you could then associate that field with another field somewhere else, another place in the world. And that was through a unique identifier, like a photograph, coordinates, address, like a legal address. And that instant connection, that field activated. There was quite a history before I arrived with Clayten and the inventor, so maybe I'll pass it over to him to talk about that.
Yeah, so this inventor was a interesting character. He was the one, well, the one that was left by the time Jeff and I visited his place. There was three of them originally, and they were working on this from about 2000 to 2007, and they eventually, kind of ran out of money, I think, and they just thought they would never be able to create their energy device. So they had to, you can only work on something for so long. And then you need to find a way to live in the world in abundance. So they were at the end of that cycle. And this one gentleman, he was retired and had enough money that he would just keep going forever. And he did until he passed. He was a millwright, an electrician, a tool and die maker. So his garage was a machine shop, electronic shop. I mean, it was a warehouse, and his house was, had all this equipment in it. He had like a little table for himself, and the rest of his house was pretty well dedicated to his work. Interesting man. So he found out that if he put crystals in this output stack, because there's these kind of input stacks, and then it all came down to this little area, and then it went out through this output stack, the energy. And if you put crystals or things like broken marble countertops in that area and put it around his house, the level of consciousness in his house would go up. It was very, very high in there. And it was quite an experience for most of us who walked in. He was used to it, but it was a real adaptation. I mean, when we went in there and came out, usually you were buzzing for the better part of a day. Jeff's got some pretty good stories about that. Maybe he'll share one with us. But that was, I met the gentleman because I had a health challenge, and I was using kinesiology based upon the work of Dr. David Hawkins to try to find the most appropriate technology and other interventions that would help me. And his type of technology and the power of it was pretty unique. And so we worked together a lot. I'm pretty good at kinesiology, and he did a type of dowsing as well. And some of these things, it's hard to know when you're inventing things. It's sometimes, you're praying for help. There's lots of stories of inventors falling asleep on their desk or nodding off their desk, and they wake up and they have an idea. Well, where does that idea come from? So we had lots of those experiences, not necessarily falling asleep, but we were using kinesiology and prayer. We would get a thought, we would test it with kinesiology. He would make a piece, put it in the machine. We would test the output. He had oscilloscopes and all types of things to measure output. And then we would use kinesiology, as Dr. Hawkins taught it, to measure the level of consciousness of that effect, as well as the voltage and the amperage and the watts and everything that ran through the machine. So that's a little bit more about the story of how the beginning of FLFE evolved. It evolved out of a health challenge, and then we got to know the inventor and became pretty fundamental in the progress of the technology. And then he'd kind of taken it as far as he could. He was getting old and sort of frail. And, at that time we would call it maybe a Model A car, and we've turned it into maybe a Tesla would be a good example of a car where you can do over-the-air updates, and, it's kind of the state of the art in as far as we understand it. So that's another piece of the story.
Thank you. I was wondering if Clayten, if you can speak a little bit more about I usually tell Jason at some point during the day, Jason, I think we're ready for a boost. And
Oh, yes.
I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more about that. And for those folks that are listening in or watching who are a little bit more sensitive or not, you can just tune in and see how your body changes once Clayten is actually going to explain what he's going to do and the technology that's going to be implemented. I wonder if you can speak to that.
Sure. Yeah. So FLFE has this capacity to create high consciousness fields, and we discovered a way to give the people that want to try this service an opportunity to be their own consciousness researcher. So if you do a free trial of the service, you will have access to a control panel. And in the control panel, you'll be able to slide the level of consciousness of the property up or slide it down. It's like a slider. And you also will have access to boosts. So boosts are temporarily higher states of consciousness that you can put on your property or around an object such as a phone. We call them boosts because that's just kind of how, you know, the name emerged. And so we thought we would do an experiment with Jason and Taya today, and Jeff and I talked about this, and give us an opportunity to do a consciousness experiment together. So the level of consciousness between us is probably in the love zone anyway, because we seem to have a lot in common and we get along well, and that's generally a loving environment. And we can boost the level of consciousness on the recording so that whenever you listen to it, there is a 700 field, a 700 on the Hawkins map of consciousness, around the listener. So we can do that anytime you're ready.
Yeah,
Give us a boost.
Yeah, I think let's turn that up, and for all the participants, then as you're going through, just see if you notice anything. A lot of these things are sort of subtle, and we'll kind of talk about different research that's been done on it over the last while, but just sort of tune back into your body, see what it feels like. To me, it's, like when you guys were talking about stepping into the inventor of the technology's house and feeling this. I mean, if you've gone to different places, I remember going to like the Buddha relics and different things, and it's like
the Buddha relics, yeah.
You're in a very different, I mean, I think Dr. Hawkins said that was in the 900s.
I went to one in Vancouver when it was there. It was extraordinary.
Yeah, that's the one that we went to, I believe, too.
No, it was.
That was in Ontario. Yeah. That's right.
Ontario.
But you can go to different places. Different sites in the world will have different levels of consciousness. From spiritual teachers, things that they possessed carry a certain level of consciousness on them. So what Clayton's going to do is he's going to set the FLFE up so that everybody that's participating in this episode and listening to it is going to be exposed to that frequency or that consciousness field. So yeah, I think if you're ready, let's turn it on, and then it'll be on for the rest of the episode.
I don't know about you, Jeff. I turned it on a minute or two ago.
Yeah, I did too.
Oftentimes when we're talking, it takes a little more time it's kind of a slow, mellow upgrade. Because typically you don't want to have silence on a conversation like this. So it might take a little bit to feel the mellow.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Thank you.
Can we talk, just for people that are still sort of wrapping their head around what this is, can we talk about fields of consciousness? And even how Dr. Hawkins kind of laid out the map a little bit, but maybe let's talk about fields of consciousness and how they actually can affect somebody. Why is it important to be in a field that's of a higher level of consciousness versus a lower field? What does that actually mean for the average person?
And maybe even the relationship between consciousness and frequency. Are they the same thing? Are they different? How do they correlate?
Well, our focus is consciousness, and using the Hawkins map as levels. Frequency tends to get interchanged, but it can also mean very specific oscillation of a wave. So consciousness field is really not that, but maybe at the basic level they're all the same. I don't know, but so consciousness fields are all around us all the time as we walk around our world. And I think the body is, bodies are sensitive to different degrees, but it seems to be like an evolutionary piece for us where you can walk into a place and it feels safe or it doesn't feel safe. And people say, well, the energy feels good here. But if you walk into a place where the energy doesn't feel good, you're on edge. You're looking over your shoulder. You want to watch your back. And we can experience those fields in like an old prison or a battlefield. And there's a kind of heavy energy, maybe a not safe feeling. And that's these low consciousness fields are around, and our sensitivity to it can help us. High consciousness fields, like we mentioned, around those Buddha relics and pilgrimage sites around the world, you get that elevated feeling, maybe similar to this 700 field we're feeling, where, kind of up the center, you might feel elevated and a little buzzy, and more personal energy is there for us. It's just more chi, more prana is there to come in and feed our body and the innate immune system, the innate intelligence of the body takes that energy and uses it. It also seems to enhance mental activity, the energy that it takes to do some kind of cognitive task. And we have a pilot study on that on our website with the Institute of Noetic Sciences. So in this energy, there's more of it for us, but also different consciousness fields can have different information in the field. So we had a customer that, would listen to our podcast, talk about consciousness fields, and they were on a hike and they came out of the woods to a place they'd never been before. And there's back of a big billboard up here. And they both start talking about French fries. Oh, we need to get some French fries. Where can we get French fries? And they walk around to the front of the board on their way to find French fries, and it's a French fry advertisement. So there was a field of French fries, there. So that information was in the field, even at the back of the billboard, right? So all this is around us all the time. And the more that we're aware that these are affecting what we're thinking, like, why am I wanting French fries right now? Maybe we'll make a different choice. We'll eat something different. So that's the other thing with consciousness fields. There could be thought fields or thought forms there as well, and maybe emotional feelings. And sometimes in those low spots, you feel, depressed or angry or, some low emotion. So in the FLFE environment, it's a high unconditional love consciousness field. So there's more energy available. And then there's lots of information to support the innate intelligence of the body and to support us to be, really to rise in consciousness. That's the whole intent of the environment, is to be as pristine as possible space for us to really be our best self, and to let those lower vibrating parts of us start to rise and be loved and healed. And that's kind of this almost a forgiveness aspect of unconditional love is there in a field. And I'll just mention one more thing. Have you ever seen Amma the hugging saint? Have you ever gotten a hug from her? I mean, that just like that hug just takes away so much of your lower vibrating parts, that whether it's mother love or father love, and that field around her, you can feel it as you walk closer and closer to her, as you wait in line to go up there for the hug. It's like, and Clayton's mapped out the actual level of consciousness of the field around Amma the hugging saint. It's very interesting. So those fields are all around us, and the higher they are, the more it seems to help our evolution move forward and our health and well-being.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we were talking earlier, you had mentioned around resilience. And I know how Dr. Hawkins used to talk about it was that the field of consciousness is essentially like the lens that you see your world at. So a lot of times we don't totally realize, but in certain fields of consciousness, that is our reality. We are seeing the world through a certain lens. And then when we see the world through a certain lens, then we interact with the world in a certain way. So if we're in a field of fear, for example, then we see a scary world. We see a scary God. Our relationship with divinity is different. The choices that we then make are all based around that field. And I often think of fields as like even like the pool that you're sort of drawing from. So it's like if you're in a limited field of consciousness, you've only got a certain number of possibilities within that field to make changes in your life. And the smaller the field, the harder it is to make big changes in your life. When you create a larger, more expanded field, you're now encompassing more possibilities. So there's more ways to influence your life. And when you start to to me, it helps a lot when I think of it from how I'm viewing the world, because if I'm feeling frustrated and I'm seeing that, I can start to catch that, oh, like maybe that's not actually as irritating as I think it is, but that's just sort of where I'm viewing things at the moment. If I can actually get myself into a different state of consciousness, I'll see the exact same situation very differently. I mean, if any parents usually will notice this. It's like you'll find that you're shorter with your kids when you are more stressed or when you're in a bit more of a frustrated field, where the exact same situation wouldn't bug you at all when you're in a different state of consciousness. So it gives us the power back, I feel like, to us to influence our life in a certain way. And I think I mentioned before, to me, I think of it like the terrain theory. It's like the more that we support the terrain, we just are able to deal with our life with so much more buffer than we are when our terrain is really unhealthy. No different than if you're, eating really bad quality foods or something like that, and you're going to be more prone to other types of problems. You make certain changes with that, and all of a sudden the terrain changes and you have more resilience and more buffer. Does that kind of make sense from how you guys are sort of viewing it from your perspective with the FLFE?
Yeah, higher levels of consciousness create an innate capacity of those in that field. There is more capacity to be, if a higher level of consciousness is more loving, so you would have more love and patience for the child and yourself, the outer child and maybe the inner child. So, yeah, that's definitely a principle that we've noticed. And people go to these pilgrimage sites, and they have gone to them for eons, as long as humans have been alive, probably, to have an elevated experience and to be reborn in a high consciousness field. You could say it that way. And that's the nature of humans' understanding of these special places that have these extraordinary energies. They allow us to find the highest part of ourselves, the highest possibility.
We're just going to mention when Dr. Gary Schwartz came on our team, one of the first things we did was sort of look at all the testimonials, all the comments that we had received, make a cloud, and then do a set of questions. And the two top characteristics that people noticed were ability to forgive self and others. So that's kind of this, as you're saying, this part of, as you're in a higher field, there's parts of yourself that you've shunned or pushed away and that you don't like, that start to rise and start to receive the love, and that forgiveness can really be a great tool to move ourselves forward as more of a unity instead of a lot of fractured pieces that don't talk to each other. And the second one was the ability to turn a negative thought into a positive thought. So this idea of, in an unconditional love area or environment, that you notice that negative thought, first of all, it's not just an automatic response. It's more, you have a little distance to say, oh, that's negative. Now I can switch it to a positive. So I think that's part of building resilience, in that you can roll with what's happening and easily forgive and easily sort of transform yourself as you move along.
Yeah, and it doesn't always feel like you're having to try so hard. I actually feel like, Dr. Hawkins would usually say it's not A plus B plus C equals D. It's A, B, C, D all together, the field first, which then creates what we think we see sort of from an idea of cause and effect. It's ultimately the field takes place first.
So it's not like an intellectual endeavor.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times we tend to go to an intellectual endeavor for almost everything. We're trying to figure out, how can I change this? How can I forgive this person?
How can I forgive this son of a bitch?
Yeah.
Yes.
It's like that's the way. Yeah, exactly. And what I find is, it's like, it just doesn't work like that. It's like forgiveness is a field, and it's like when you hit a certain field, forgiveness is a part of that field. So the genuine feeling inside you just changes. So it's not like you're trying to do anything per se. It's like when you're basking in that field, that's a part of just what takes place within there. So it
almost wells up from within.
It totally does. Like this softness happens. I remember we did a retreat with Pema Chodron, who's a Buddhist nun, and a little bit different, but a lot of these things help create these fields of consciousness, I think. And she was talking about the like just the stopping and staying in your body and not sort of reacting. And I remember this with my stepson really clearly. I remember he'd come home and he was in a really grumpy mood, and he snapped at Tay about something. And I remember at the moment wanting to like, whoa, I got to nip that in the bud. Like that's not okay. And we had just finished doing a retreat with her. And so it was in my head. It was like, well, she would basically say this exercise was like a fear exercise, and fear stood for feel it in your body, embrace the feeling, allow the thoughts to dissolve, and then remember the millions of others going through something similar. And so it gives you a chance to pause. And she said that in that pause, eventually what happens, if you can stay with the discomfort, if you can stay with the sensation, you eventually fall into a place of openness, awareness, and warmth. And so without really thinking, it was more like that happened, and I caught myself from reacting, and I just sat there and did nothing, just sat with the feeling of sort of irritated from what had just happened. But then what spontaneously occurred was then all of a sudden it was like, I wonder why he did that. That's the openness and the awareness that maybe there is something more going on than him just being rude, right? And then all of a sudden I felt my heart open and kind of like, I wonder if he's okay. You know, like that was the feeling that kind of welled up. And then I was able to kind of like, is everything okay? What's going on? And basically kind of found out he skipped his meal, hadn't eaten, got into an argument with his good friend at school, and was just in a grumpy. But there was a place of receptivity for him to even connect with me, because otherwise it would have just been resistance. And that's all from a field, that wasn't like me intellectually trying to figure out how to do that. It was a field that created an organic space for these different things to emerge. And I feel like as a populace, humans were always trying to figure out how to make it happen. And a lot of times I actually think the real benefits happen in the surrender and sort of allowing that field to just take place. And so to me, what this is sort of creating is it's like creating this backdrop of a higher frequency field that allows for situations like that to emerge spontaneously for people without the constant intellectual trying.
Yeah, there's a saying, and we did a whole webinar on this once, that environment is more important than will. And we need to, I think we need to budget our expenditure of will very carefully, because will seems to have a limited capacity to change us. And we do need will. We need the discipline that comes with willpower. The will in this case could have been you having the willingness to attend the retreat with Pema, and having the resources in your life to do it and actually doing it. So there's will in the world that we need to exercise. And if we can use our will to create resources for the field effects to benefit us and everybody, then we're not constant relying on the intellect or the mind or the will to do the work.
I totally hear what you're saying. And what it makes me feel like is that most of the time our limited capacity with will is because we are using our will tied to the ego, the small self. And when we naturally fall into these really powerful fields, I feel like we are connecting more to the will of God. And then
spiritual will,
different will. That's that inspired, you can't stop me from doing that. And then there's almost an endless supply of it, I feel like, when it comes in from that place. And to me, that's a good gauge or like a litmus test for me to know, when am I acting from the small self or the ego mind identity or the false sense of beliefs and perceptions versus when is it really inspired and I'm connecting to something that's much larger than just this.
Yeah, and it's interesting because in that state, you're naturally inclined to be of service to others. It just goes hand in hand.
Yeah, what's important to you just starts to shift.
Yeah.
I have a question. What contributes or affects field of consciousness?
Especially now, especially
Right.
now. Yeah, what are all the different things that people might not be aware of that actually influence how they feel, how they think, all of this?
Well, as Clayton says, environment is very important. And it could be, the house you live in, it could be the neighborhood or even the country. So that's something to look at. And there are things you can do to change that. People do clearings, different kinds of clearings on their house to clear the negative history on the land or in the house. And the FLFE is one of those technologies that does that. It clears continuously because it just gives you a base to start with, right? If you're already starting down low, it's more personal work to raise the field yourself. But I think in working together, there's just a magic in two or more people coming together and working towards a positive goal, a positive intention together. That it's just like you're saying, it's more than A plus B plus C. It's a much greater field effect. And Clayton's has spent his career working on that, building that field in groups of people or two people or more. And we've used that in the business to get to, as you work together. So you have an intention, you're meeting regularly, you have each other's back personally, right? And then you're kind of parking the ego as much as you can to the side. Maybe I'll pass it to you, Clayton. What are the field building things you've discovered?
Well, I always like to start with the basics, like even just your own body. Have a shower. If you don't clean just the outside of your body, you're gonna, not only are you gonna not enjoy it, but probably the people around you won't. This is simple, right? Have a shower, or a bath or whatever. We talked about eating good food, Jason. That's, you're contributing to the vibration of your body. Brushing your teeth. Let's start with real basic stuff. And then if you go into your home, I mean, we spent a lot of time making a list of ways to raise the level of consciousness of your home. And it's no big mystery that cleaning your house raises the level of consciousness because the accumulated dust and, the thought forms that are there from, your own growth and experience, but also the people that built the house, the guests that come over, the other people that live with you in the house. So it's real kind of simple. I mean, if you talk about relational fields, we took a moment before we started this conversation, said a little prayer, and then we had a moment of silence to connect with our own version of divinity and ask for, Jeff and I usually ask that people are blessed that watch this. And so, it's a big question. It's a great question, and it has a lot of levels. Like typically you like to start from the simplest part and go up, and then if you talk about, okay, you've got sort of environmental, you've got basic physical, environmental, you've got relational, and then you get into, you can go all the way up to the rule of law in different countries. Like typically countries are better off having laws than not having laws, probably always, depending on the laws, right? Don't want to make any assumptions. So we can go right up to systems and structures and the way we, like the Constitution or the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada. What does it mean? What does the Magna Carta mean? What's the history of democracy in the world? And so if you can take that all the way up to that level of field, the more truth that's reflected in those governing documents, the better the environment is for all the people in the environment that are under the influence of those principles.
I would love to share this with the audience just so that they can see what the possibilities are. Clayten, you had mentioned to us when we spoke with you earlier that about our house and where it was at as far as the field of consciousness that it was in when we first moved in, where it's at now, and where it has the potential to be with the boost or the assistance as well. And I'm wondering if you don't mind sharing that.
I can't remember all the numbers. What I do recall is that, it shifted because of the influence of yourself and your family. You're positive people and loving people, probably 95% of the time. We all have our moments, right? So it likely started in the 300s, and after you moved in, it probably came close to the 500s. I don't recall the exact data. I don't have it with me, and it's hard for me to test on the fly when I'm, under the eye. And then, after you put FLFE on, it's probably very close to 600 because of the nature of your work and your devotion. And so for those who aren't familiar with the Hawkins map of consciousness, it's a logarithmic scale from 1 to infinity, or 0.0000, I don't know how many zeros, 1, because there has to be some existence to measure. And it goes all the way to infinity, which is divinity is infinity, is our little memory trick. In the human realm, it goes from 1 to 1,000. 200 is integrity, 500 is love, 600 is the beginning of enlightenment. The mid 550s are unconditional love, which is that's the level that, through our research, that's the optimal place to start for most people. So FLFE is defaulted to create a field of consciousness at 550, and that's guaranteed to be at that level 98% of the time over a 24-hour period. So that would be, the evolution of your home would be similar to other people that are on a spiritual path like you. I think the average in Canada, it's a lot lower than it used to be, but it might be in the mid 200s. And then, depending on the people that are living there, and I'm a big fan of feng shui. I mean, I like FLFE, I love it. And I also get my houses feng shuied. And we also have a person locally that we use who comes in and sort of checks how the energy is flowing in the neighborhood, because especially like after there's some construction, things can change, and he'll put crystals in the ground and things like that. And you notice the difference in the house. It feels different, and the level of consciousness changes as a result as well. You use all the tools you have.
Yeah, that's why I found this so fascinating, because it was, part of my research and stuff that we've been pulling in was looking at a lot of that sort of work. And I'd come across the work by Dr. Ibrahim Karim around biogeometry and the way that he would explain, the absolute reality made a lot of sense to me based on other things that we were coming across. And it's this idea that what we know from our perceived reality is really, really limited. And it's basically been explained that we know about 0.003% of the absolute reality. And yet the absolute reality is interacting with us and creating effects. So you had talked about thought forms and energy forms and emotions. It's like, when you start to go back and look and think, okay, a lot of times people might be aware now of just the inundation of different physical frequencies. So whether those are, Wi-Fi and 5G and sound waves and radio waves and all these different things that we're sort of bathing in substantially more than what it was for our grandparents. Like literally, I think it's almost like 1 billion times more than what it was like for our grandparents. It's a huge, huge change. Even though we don't see those things, they can actually be playing into how we feel. And sometimes we don't even, I feel like a lot of times it's like people get hijacked and it's not even really them. It's how their body's feeling because of interaction with all these different things. And that's just the physical stuff. Outside of that, I think, Jeffrey, you had mentioned, it's like you come into fields of information, like the French fries. I'll say this with my kids very easily. It's like we'll be thinking something and they will already pick up on it because that has already been put out into the field and they're very receptive to it. But that can be for benefit or for not so benefit. So
Mhm.
when I think of it, just people, I know like you go into the subway, and if a shady character comes in, you feel the entire field of the subway car shift very quickly. And I actually use it as an experiment before. I would sit there and see if I could even bring more loving presence into myself and see if we could actually fill the field up with that as sort of, these are things that once you, I think, you become aware of it, you start to play with it a little bit differently. But then you also want to do all these different things to sort of mitigate it as much as you can. So, I mean, we started off with a lot of the biogeometry to sort of clean up the space and mitigate EMF and electricity and all of these different things. And then this has been another layer on top of that to create this sort of, I feel literally like you're creating these sort of beneficial bubbles over yourself, over your space, over these different things, so that you just are not.
Or dome even.
Yeah, I literally think of it like a dome. And I know how
Mhm.
Dr. Kareem would talk about is that's how they used to do stuff back in the day in Egypt. They would use the energies that were coming in the earth in specific power spots. They would connect it with the specific stars, and they would literally create like a dome that would be prosperous for everybody within the city. We don't adhere to any of those principles anymore. So it's a combination of, can you incorporate some of those principles back in through things like feng shui and biogeometry and design principles, connecting to positive beneficial earth energies, bringing them in. And then I'm always fascinated by like newer technology that's coming in that's beneficial, that's using, whether it's scalar technology or something along those lines, that's able to funnel different information into a field. I think it's fascinating. What is the FLFE? Is it a scalar type of technology, or is it within that sort of realm? And how does that actually work? As much as you're able to sort of explain.
The way FLFE has developed, and from the original inventor that we talked about, there's definitely a geometry aspect to it. There's, I think at last count, like 6 different technologies that are part of that, and it makes really a unique combination. And there may be some longitudinal type waves in that, but it's really a unique mix that, from what we can tell, is the most similar to human consciousness in the way that human beings can activate a space and create a connection, across time and space. And plenty of evidence that happens. And there's something about the geometry of the brain that allows us to do that. And so we believe there's a connection in the way that FLFE is, has evolved. And because it is that instant connection over time and space, when someone, we're in 80 countries now, it's our subscribers. So somebody gets on the free trial and puts their address in, it's almost instantaneous. So there's no time and space there. So there may be a multidimensional aspect to it as well. So that's about the best I can give you. It isn't like we created a scalar thing and went with it, or it's one technology there's just pieces of various parts that really were, I don't know if it's a secret sauce, but it was something that this inventor discovered around geometry that was different.
Fascinating. And it sounds like it just keeps evolving too. And
I have a question with regards to, even when Clayten, you were speaking of the field of consciousness of the house. Those are major jumps that
extraordinary jumps.
Because even when I was speaking to Jason about it earlier, when Hawkins would even speak of it, there's only, I think, what did he say, like the maximum even within a lifetime that is typically seen if people are able to go up the field of consciousness is what?
It used to be like about 5 points. And I think even if you're lucky, a lot of times people have an entire lifetime and don't really have any real shift in consciousness.
So is there something special about this time that we're in that is allowing or enabling us to make such big jumps?
Well, I'll just talk to the average first. We did spend a lot of time on this, the number of points that the average person goes up in a lifetime. So the average was a planet, And in some cultures, that's very hard to go up in consciousness because you're just preoccupied with survival. When you have, warlords capturing children and bringing them into their armies and they're fighting each other all the time, I mean, that's a hard life. So in the higher the consciousness of the country, the more likely it is you'll go up. And the average in some countries is 15 as opposed to 5. So that's just an example. And as Taya said, like 1 point up on the Hawkins map of consciousness, because it's logarithmic, is 10 times more energy available. So if your house goes from, let's say before you moved in, it was in the high 200s, let's say it's 290. And, within 6 months of living there, you brought it up to 420. Well, that's, 130 to the power of 10 times more energy. That's extraordinary. In history, there's been maybe 0.00001% of homes that were at 550 on the Hawkins map of consciousness. It's pretty unusual. There are some pilgrimage sites were that or higher. And so what I believe is that the universe is a positive place. And that as humanity evolves and all the other species on the planet that contribute to that evolution, nature provides a counterbalance to keep things positive. And so technologies like FLFE and other technologies that are emerging are helping compensate for the thousands or tens of thousands of influences that Jason referred to in terms of satellites and radio stations, and cell towers and Wi-Fi routers and smart devices that are, just growing by the day. So we think that FLFE is an emergent technology that is here to support humanity to compensate for the many benefits that all these devices have created and the challenges that they also create. So, we do a lot of service work. We give away probably 95% of the energy just to help humanity in the ways that we know how. And there's other companies like us that are trying to do the same thing. Did I say that? How did I say that, Jeff? Is that pretty well? We talk about this stuff a lot.
Well, the other point is, so you've got the consciousness of the field that you're in, and then your personal consciousness, which is, an average of all the different aspects of you. And we see 30 points in 90 days is what people go up in FLFE on average. And that would be, relationship, career, life's work, those very categories that Clayten has delineated. So you may be higher in some and lower in others, but it's that average. And because of this logarithmic effect of the energy available to us in the field, that the higher we go, the more power that we have to create the life that we want and to envision and manifest as well. So we, believe in the power that humans have the power to manifest a new world. And when you're at 100 or 150, say at anger, you have a lot of that sort of physical, maybe force, but there isn't a lot of power there to manifest, a new way of living or the life you really imagine. But if you're, in the 500s and you go even higher, manifestation really occurs quickly. We have something called magnetizing that comes with the free trial and the subscription to really meditate on how can I use the power that's here to create a new world or what it is I want for myself in my own life.
Beautiful.
It kind of goes back to the 850 to the field, the higher the field and being connected to divinity. Mm-hmm. So we measure that at around 850. So that, like AA calls upon that, where you're surrendering your personal will to the larger will. And so the higher you go, the more power there is to change, it seems.
Yeah, just so the personal will calibrates at our own level of consciousness. And the principles, and for example, the 12-step program, when they call upon the spiritual will, that's just one example because it's pretty prevalent in Hawkins' work. The spiritual will calibrates at 850. So for those who are struggling with addiction, even if they're at a certain level of consciousness, they may be quite high. Sometimes their own will isn't enough to help them change. And so they call upon the will of that which is greater than themselves, or a higher power. And lots of ways to say that. You could call it divinity. That will is stronger than theirs, and that helps them overcome things that they can't do on their own. And we get kind of technical sometimes and measure those things. And when Dr. Hawkins said, you call upon the spiritual will to help you change things that you can't change in yourself. Well, it took me weeks to find out a definition of spiritual will that I finally related to. And then because we spent a lot of time measuring things, we had to measure the level of consciousness of all that statement. And then later on, I think in one of his thousands of hours of material, he mentions, oh yeah, by the way, the spiritual will calibrates at 850. We came up with the same thing. So, but
that's always fun when you see it show up like that.
yeah.
But yeah, and I remember, Dr. Hawkins would often talk about the importance of spiritual community, because of that idea around that the entire load of everybody supports, it all supports the ships in the sea. And I think the Buddha said the next Buddha was going to be Sangha, like the community. Same idea. It's not necessarily this person outside of us that we're looking to. It's really creating that amongst ourselves and interconnections. So, which I think is happening a lot right now through different ways, through this type of way, we're connected. I know through the podcast, we've connected with an amazing community. And then also on the ground, gradually building more and more community in different supportive ways. Clayten, would you be able to walk us through a bit of a timeline on consciousness on the planet, as far as like, where are we now? Where have we been? What does that even mean? Where are we kind of moving to? I think that would be really helpful for people to see that. Or Jeffrey, whichever one has the access to the PowerPoint. We'll put a little picture up here so people can check it out on the YouTube.
Yeah, and if you're listening through audio, please check out the YouTube video because there's the benefit of visuals that you'll have watching the video.
Well, you can start us off, Jeff. You started off, and then I'll maybe pick up the second one.
Well, we looked back 3,000 years and did kinesiology, muscle testing. And we always do kinesiology in a team where we're both testing, or if there's three people are testing, and we're checking each other's numbers. So it's part of having, first of all, a very clear inquiry. In this case, we're looking at the level of consciousness over a certain period of time on average. And so if you're looking at the chart, you'll see that, going back 3,000 years, that the level of consciousness of the Earth, and this is the Earth altogether on average, was below 200, maybe 90 on the Hawkins map. So, it just sort of represents that there was a lot of survival going on, a lot of early history. There was small groups maybe battling with each other, or, just scarce resources. So you can see it's a very slow increase, kind of starting before Christ was born and kind of coming up through that period of time. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that? So, Clayten, when we hit 150, things sort of started to take off a little bit.
Yeah. So if you look at the Hawkins map, down around 100 is fear. And so there were places on the planet in history. I mean, people talk about Atlantis and Lemuria, where you had small areas of high consciousness. And so we took the average of the world, and we were really curious about what was happening right around 2020 when COVID arrived, and that's delineated quite clearly in the bottom graph. So back in 1000 AD, the level of consciousness of the planet was 90. Let's say around Christ's birth. Christ's birth was around maybe 105, right around 100, and then it slowly went up 500 BC, it was at, say, 125, 1000 BC, around 150. So 100 is anger, 100 is fear, 150 is anger. And then around 1500, it was at 190. And it stayed at 190 right through until about 1986. And in 1986, the world went over 200 for the first time in history as a whole. And it fluctuated a little bit. And then in 2019, the world was at the highest it's ever been on the planet. That was about in the high 240s. During COVID, we'll start to go into the second chart, and we separated a couple of countries out. We separated the US and Canada out because, Jeff lives in the US, and actually we just separated out US in this one. So we did the world overall, and then we did the US. So do you want to pick up the bottom chart, Jeff, and then we'll talk maybe about the principles of that we talked about earlier in terms of our ascension?
Yeah. So, as the world was at its highest spot towards the end of 2019, so the highest level of consciousness overall, the US was in the mid 420s or so. And, there was a sense of optimism and abundance, and things were moving forward in the world. And with the advent of all the the COVID media coverage and all the things that were happening, I don't know, you can call it what you like. There was fear. People went to fear. And so we were down at 100 in that sort of early 2020. And it was like you mentioned, Jason, we're in this field fear surrounding us. And so we were seeing the world in that way, many of us. Those in FLFE at that time, there was some participation in that, of course, but there was a feeling of sanctuary that was occurring. So there was, we were glad to be in a bubble. And you just had to turn off the news, and that's what we advise our community. It's like, do you really need to watch this? So that, from that time, it came up to anger. So there were, as you went into June, there was anger. I mean, people were either angry at the system and the restrictions and things that were happening to them, or maybe they were anger within families. There was definitely a lot of division that was going on. Some people believed, that this was happening. Some people had different ideas. And, as we started to climb up towards, October, November was more towards hope, like we're coming out of this. The worst has happened. And it's in kind of the US and the world were about at the same area, right? Kind of getting to the hope zone. We had a bleep, the US Capitol event, we had a blip down. But then the US really started to climb back up into the, not as high as we were, but into the 350s, the upper 350s. So that continued, through into December of 21, and that's when Ukraine started. And then you can see the dip there. So really these two events, the COVID and the Ukraine, had a very large effect on the world. If we only go to 2022 in this chart, it's kind of bumped along roughly the same since then.
When we were talking about this earlier with Jason and Taya, we were using a metaphor of trying to climb a mountain. And when you're climbing in consciousness, it is a little bit of a struggle at times. Sometimes it's an enormous struggle. And when you're climbing a mountain, there's a process called setting up base camp. And so you set up a base camp at a certain elevation. And then you have to walk down the mountain and you have to bring up resources so you can maintain that base camp. And then you need to keep bringing those resources up. And then once you're established at one level of elevation, then if you want to go up higher, you need to set up a new base camp, because you can only go so far in altitude in a couple of days Otherwise, you're susceptible to altitude sickness. So the hope that we have for humanity is that we are, and this relates to creating a new world, is that because of the highest level of consciousness that the world was in 2019, and in Hawkins' work, there's a quality of consciousness that exists below 200, and going over 200 is a significant change in not only the amount of power, but the quality of power. So there is a distinction there that's 199 to 201 is very different than 195 to 197. There's a different quality of consciousness. And in one of his thousands of hours of videos, he talks about every 50 points, it's not necessarily as big of a change in quality of consciousness from 199 to 201 or 499 to 501. Those are both significant changes. But there is another type of base camp. And so if you do a lot of measurement on people's level of consciousness, if they have a part of their life that is below, say, a 50-point integer, they typically will slow down as they get to that integer, and then they'll stabilize at that 50-point integer. And then when they jump in consciousness, they don't go from, say, 250 to 251, they go from 250 to 258. And you'll notice when people are going from, say, 199 to over 200, they go from 199 to like 220 or something. There's like a tension there that when you break through it, there's a lot of runway or a lot of freedom after. And that's true of the high 400s and into 500. People oftentimes go through that level, and they go through it to a large degree. And then they might come back, and have to relearn lessons that they haven't learned to be able to stabilize it and keep it. And so our theory at this point is that humanity is going through a process of going to the next base camp of being over 250 on the planet, and that there's some lessons for us to learn to be able to, because we're getting very close to that. There's some lessons that we have to learn to transcend that and stabilize at that new base camp level, at that new level of consciousness. And the lessons that the Ukraine war and other wars present, and the lessons of COVID, or present the opportunity for us to grow through those lessons and establish ourselves in this new world, which is the focus of the series of talks that you're facilitating, Jason, Taya.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think that's very much what's happening on the planet right now, and generally with humanity. And I feel what's unique about right now is I feel like even when we look back and see like different areas where we were higher in consciousness, I generally feel like we're not even going back. It's not like we're going back to that same field of consciousness. I feel like we are given an opportunity to really be catapulted into something that I don't think we've ever really experienced before collectively.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm really curious to even see what that's possible. I've even questioned myself that even when Dr. Hawkins was here, and he would say, it is a human vessel, the most that our physical body can actually handle is up to a level of 1,000. And basically just because of how the nervous system works. But from my understanding is literally we are going through physiological changes in our bodies right now. And I wonder what's actually going to be possible if even that scale might expand beyond what Dr. Hawkins was even aware of at that time that he was here testing that. So it's a really interesting time to even see what is possible. I'm just very excited and curious to see what's going to happen. But I totally think that right now it's that kind of challenge and pressure that is literally unlocking the potential for us to experience something. And like you're talking about the base camp, you have to sometimes go through these challenges to, I think, even unlock those parts of ourselves that we're needing for these new times.
Yeah, we see that in the FLFE field when customers come in for the first time, and we have a community that's grown around it. And we had Facebook, and today we moved to our own platform that we completely control called FLFE Space, where new people come in and things are rising up to be healed. And that's kind of what it feels like this time we're in the world, where this anger will come up or this despair will come up, and it just is coming up to dissipate. And it's sort of coming through the body, and out. And so I think that maybe, the personal and the world are really in microcosm and macrocosm. So the other thing that's interesting is, I don't know if you've looked at any spiral dynamics. Spiral dynamics integral is something that Ken Wilber had taken, Cohen and others had done this spiral dynamics work. It's kind of similar to the Hawkins map in some ways. It's a little more macro, but they have this spiral shape and this breakdown that occurs between levels, where old patterns, old beliefs, old institutions crumble, and we're in this chaotic mess, and the new emerges out of it. But it just feels really chaotic and unsafe maybe in that period of time, because our old belief's gone and our new one hasn't completely formed yet. Sort of the dark night of the soul is another way to look at it, where we've ascended to a point where all of a sudden it's blank. We're not connecting in the way we used to, but we're forming these new capacities, like you say, as all parts of ourselves come online. It's part of, we have these, we've talked earlier about these parts of us that are younger or immature, that we suppress. As those all start to come online, then our whole self is really available for the next stage.
When we were talking to Ralph a few episodes back, specifically on the topic of water, he said that the technology that he has created is basically working with different geometric patterns, and within those technologies, the bacteria that would negate the quality of the water and the purity of the water is actually not able to sit in the water with the technology that he's created. And it makes me think of your technology as well with FLFE, in that the level of consciousness, the field of consciousness that you're creating and holding for individuals or houses makes it conducive to a certain level of consciousness, where a lower level of consciousness is just not able to inhabit that space for very long at all.
Yeah, a lot of people find that they bounce back quicker from moods. I mean, we talked about earlier the ability to forgive. So that's a high consciousness state. Unforgiveness is a low consciousness state. The ability to change a negative thought from to a positive, that would be a low consciousness influence that is easier to change to a positive. So yeah, I would say that's a good metaphor. It's more difficult for falsehood to exist in the presence of truth or lovingness. We don't often think of truth as lovingness, but in Hawkins' work anyway, Jason Atea, I mean, he talks about the 400s being the levels of reason and logic and the profession such as accounting and the legal profession, where they have, principles that they have to follow in order to have like engineering, you have to follow certain principles to have a bridge that you can trust to carry a certain amount of weight for a certain amount of time and a certain amount of frequency. And so those aren't subject to opinion. They're mathematical truths. And we rely upon those every time we get into a car or on a plane or cross a bridge. So reason is our friend.
Mm-hmm. That's what I think has been so interesting with these times, because and it's why I think a lot of times, people that are familiar with some of this work or have thought of, like, I think about it like from science. Real science is supposed to be in the 400s, but I think what's also we've seen in many different ways is that science is actually can be very manipulated and used for very different ways. So, because I know I would just get a feeling on it, I would see, and then I did series of interviews on experts looking at how stats are manipulated, all these things. So it's like, there's a perspective of like, okay, science is supposed to be this. And yeah, absolutely, the original concept of science. But now what we're seeing is a lot of things that I think are piggybacking off of a certain universal understanding that that's supposed to be a certain standard. is not actually being held at that standard
No,
in many
it's
ways.
not.
And this is a part of what I think is this shakeup that makes us feel like we don't have a lot of grounding, because stuff that we put a lot of faith in doesn't hold the same water anymore. And it's going to cause a shakeup to eventually, I think, create a much higher standard for everything that's going to be held accountable to. And I'm really excited to see what happens with that.
And I actually wanted to just review with you, what is a person to expect? Because when we did your 15-day free trial, we had the experience, and then that trial ended and we had a few days off, and one of your representatives checked in with me, and I said, well, it's hard to tell what I felt or didn't feel because there's so much going on individually and collectively around us. It's hard to pinpoint. But then the few days that we were without the trial, I felt that, oh, okay, there's something different. There's definitely something different. I feel that there's more agitation, and I wasn't able to even pinpoint exactly what the physical symptoms were. But there was a great webinar that you guys just came out with recently
with Dr. Gary Schwartz.
With Dr. Gary
yeah.
Schwartz. And it was helpful to actually listen in, because I was able to, rather than just on an intuitive level, knowing that let's go back and sign our house up for FLFE. What the doctor was pointing out, it made so much sense, and it allowed me to actually pinpoint the physical symptoms that I had experienced under FLFE and then without it. So I know for me personally, the level of brain fog, my sleep had lifted, and my sleep had improved tremendously. Like typically I would be waking up for between 6 to sometimes even 10 times through the night. But like last night, it was undisturbed sleep, which hasn't happened for such a long time. Irritability, that comes up often, and you take it on as if it's a personality flaw. But I know that going through this experience with the technology that you guys have made available, I was able to notice, wow, I have so much more patience with the kids. Thank gosh, there's hope, because it's not just me and this flaw that's a part of me, but there's this field that I'm sensitive to and picking up stuff, and then it translates in different ways. But there's quite a few physical symptoms that I was wondering if you guys can even go over, and what in the research that you've done.
What you're speaking about is this EMF mitigation research that we did with Dr. Gary Schwartz, and it's kind of one of the series of experiments that we did, because we noticed years ago that the level of consciousness was dropping in properties on the FLFE service. And we'd call the customer, we'd find out it's an EMF influence. It's a new cell tower, it's smart meters, it's a stronger router. And it was causing it to not feel good for them, and not feel as good as it had, and it had dropped. So we come at EMFs as a consciousness lowering influence, kind of it's in our lens of consciousness. So I think that's one of the things you're feeling is the EMF influence, the top kind of mitigation effects where, you had insomnia, anxiety, brain fog, headaches, joint pain. There's a list of 30 different symptoms that people who are sensitive to EMFs, and I think we're all sensitive to some extent, we're experiencing. And we had recruited people that had never heard of us, but they were to some extent suffering, sometimes really suffering, sometimes mildly suffering from EMFs. And they could tell because they would get near a router, they would feel sick. But what we saw overall was a kind of a high level of anxiety. I mean, I think you'd said it, there's like a feeling in your body of tension or anxiety or disturbance. that may be from all of these different routers and things turning on and off, satellites going overhead, that are influencing our bodies in ways we're not used to from our genetic history of experiencing. And so when we brought people into the FLFE field, the top items were insomnia, lessening, sleep much deeper. For some people, it was the best sleep they'd had in years and years. Reduction in anxiety. And for me, it's a physical feeling in the body, but you don't know. You think you're anxious, but really your body's just disturbed. And then anxiety, then you can project on your conversation you're having. Oh, I feel anxious. It must be what you're saying. It must be what the kids are doing. But it's a physical response. Our body's like, this doesn't feel good. How do I get out of here? Flu-like symptoms. So that's kind of aches and pains and almost like like you're allergic kind of response. Brain fog, as you mentioned, was another big one, where I think the body is so busy dealing with these perturbations, and then maybe there's cellular and deeper changes happening, that the body has to try to deal with and remove from the body, and it can result in brain fog because you've got like a healing crisis happening from EMFs. So we saw that abating. And a really interesting one in this last, so this is our fourth EMF experiment. And this is a replication. It's an N of 40 people. But depression came up in that top 5. And that was really interesting to us because we've been hearing stories from people about depression waning in sometimes dramatic ways. We're not making health claims, but this came up in this survey as one of the top 5 effects. So there may be something to do with just low energy, like the body is busy. It's like when you get sick, you get low energy. Well, maybe when you're fighting EMFs, you have somewhat lower energy too.
I personally think this is a really important point because I find, I mean, clinically, there's so many different things that affect how people feel. And there's this sort of tendency, and I don't think this is all bad. There's aspects of this that we need to do, but there's a tendency, especially for mental, emotional kind of symptoms where you feel agitated or you feel depressed or something along those lines. Then you kind of get on yourself and you try to figure out what's wrong with you. Why are you doing that? And there's nothing wrong with the self-exploration around that. But to me, it's like there's so many other factors that can be nothing to do with you that are tweaking things within your body, causing you to then feel a certain way, which then causes you to interact with your environment in a certain way that never started with anything that was really you to begin with. Like, to me, I think of it no different than if I see someone that, you know, ate a food that they're highly sensitive to, and all of a sudden it caused them to be incredibly, have brain fog and maybe have low energy or feel depressed or feel anxious, or someone that had extremely low blood sugar because they can't manage that and it affects their mood, or if they've got a big imbalance with copper and zinc that's causing them to create too much norepinephrine or something and causing them to feel anxious and can't sleep and all these things. Like there's all these different factors. So if we think of all of these other frequencies that we are essentially being exposed to as no different than some of these other things that we kind of understand more consciously, like foods and nutrients and these types of things, to me, it's all the same stuff. And if you can do something to try and mitigate that barrage of things that are often well outside of your perceived awareness, you just may start to function differently in the world. To me, I see I see that no different than I see all those other factors.
There was a list, Taya, to your thought about recognizing the influence of a higher consciousness field. I think in the second or third day, once you've been on the free trial, you'll get an email that it used to be 27 ways to recognize the influence of FLFE. It might have, we've probably edited a few times. Sometimes we put 2 together. But there's lots of ways that it can be revealed. And so because your home was pretty high to begin with, the contrast isn't going to be as big as another environment. Like if you were in a really low environment, it might be a 300-point jump as opposed to a 60-point jump. And so there's things like paying attention to your plants and your pets and your children and lots of other things in your environment that are more, plants are a pretty good placebo, right? So are our pets, because they can't talk to us, and even though we can communicate with our pets, we're not having a conversation with them about, well, I just put FLFE on and the level of consciousness is now 560, so you should be behaving this way, So they do have intelligence for sure. They're pretty amazing pets. But pets and plants and friends coming over and saying, what did you do with the house? Did you paint it? Or friends coming over and not leaving because they feel so comfortable. Your house becomes a center for, yeah, there's a lot of stories of that. We've had people say, yeah, I really like FLFE, but it's not costing me, this amount of money. It's costing me several $100s a month, because all of a sudden all our friends want to come to our place and hang out. And so our grocery bill shot through the roof. So there's things like that you just notice over time. And
one other thing I did notice, Clayton, that I was actually going to change, because where we are, we'll sometimes get wasp nests that'll want to build in the area. And there was one specific area that they kept coming back to, and I would have to clean it out. And then generally within a few days, I'd see them starting to try and build it again. And that had gone on several times that I cleaned it. And then I was about to actually go out and specifically do some biogeometry around that area to sort of mitigate that. And it was right around the same time we were starting. And so I said, I'm going to leave it and just see what happens. It was around the time that we
were starting with you.
And they still have not gone back to that place yet to rebuild. So if anything, actually, they're not even down by the house as much now. So that was another interesting one to see that I'm just thinking of now as we're talking about it. So lots of different ways that I think these things.
And is there a level then of entrainment? So once there's the FLFE technology being utilized in the space, the way you're speaking of it, it's almost as if the environment and the people are entrained to a higher level of or field of consciousness. Is that accurate?
Entrainment's one way to think about it. It's a field effect, when we look at Hawkins' work and just our experience of being in a higher place, there's an uplifting. And entrainment may be more of a beat, kind of a pattern or frequency, but it's a good way to think about it. There's like, we're engaging with the field. Parts of us are kind of connecting with that field, our personal field, with the environment that we're in, and that there's like a gradual rise that occurs. I always think of it almost like a like a trampoline. There's this lower support that we have, and so that without that going lower in that support, we're more naturally rising, and there's more energy and there's more love there. And I think it's like an upward spiral that seems to happen.
Guys, as we're coming close to finishing up here, is there any new research that you guys are doing that sounds really fascinating? I know you got something you're checking with water, and even working with the lab in Japan that Dr. Emoto used to have that his son runs now. I'd love to hear what you guys are looking at doing and what you're finding so far.
Well, we do have some images of Dr. Emoto taking pictures of FLFE water. So we have a control, and then we have FLFE everywhere and FLFE for the property service. We'll call it the flagship product. And if you look at the standardized images that Dr. Emoto created, such as beauty, love, gratitude, happiness, he would take a sticker and put it on a bottle, freeze the water, and take the image. The FLFE crystal, a frozen crystal picture that he took, is halfway between truth and love. So that was interesting to see where we ended up. We're pretty evidence-based. I mean, this is a non-linear service. And so when people ask us about things, like entrainment or osmosis, usually we want to, and I know at one point we had really good definitions because we talked about that a lot, and I can't remember the definition. So we're really definition focused, right? Because, the words matter. And so we did have an interesting discovery that relates to water. I mean, most cultures have a history of blessing their food all around the world. People pray over their food. And some of the Veda cultures, they do certain mantras when they're cooking food, and they do certain mantras for certain types of food. It can be very sophisticated. And we were thinking about that one day, and we started to wonder, well, what's the most appropriate level of consciousness for food to be consumed at? And can we measure that? And if we can measure, we could probably replicate that level of consciousness with the technology. And just a little kind of insert here. A lot of people feel like, oh, I have too much technology in my life. I don't want more technology. That may be true, and technology is also part of the divine. It's part of the expression of divinity. And technology has helped humanity move forward in its consciousness. What's happened even since the year 2000 as democracy has spread around the world. Well, before that, I mean, the amount of people that have been taken out of poverty. And, even in our generation, most of our grandparents were kind of subsistence farmers. I'm not saying that's a lower level of consciousness life. You can still have that option if you want, but most of us would prefer to not have that life. I mean, my grandparents had dirt floors in their place. And, it's nice to have the option of having hardwood. And it's even nicer to have the option of heated floors. And, at some point, technology does not solve our problems. But I just wanted to insert here that technology is part of the divine, I believe. If it serves us and helps us, it gives us more time to be present with what's going on and to focus on our own evolution rather than being preoccupied with survival. That's when it's helpful. And if you want to be preoccupied with survival, there's lots of people out there that are staring into their phones all the time and they're preoccupied with something. I don't know if they have enough. They probably have enough to eat and they're probably not living on a dirt floor. But technology does provide its challenge as well as its gift. So we found out that the most appropriate level for food to be consumed at is 850 on the Hawkins map of consciousness. And so we were able to create an environment within a water bottle where the water is calibrating at 850 on the Hawkins map. And because I believe water is our most important food. And so we are looking forward to getting some pictures from Dr. Emoto's lab or some equivalent to see what an 850 FLFE structured water looks like. And so that is one of the things that we're working on these days. And I think we talked about inviting you into the beta test of that to see what your experience is.
Yeah, I think that all sounds really fascinating. I've got lots of thoughts around water and everything, and I think ultimately it's one of the most important things on likely many levels beyond what we're even currently aware of, that I think is probably going to come more to our awareness likely within the next 10, 15 years. I think there'll be lots of more research popping out around that, but I feel like it's at a foundation on everything, right from health all the way up. So
I have a question with regards to cell phones, because you have, following the free 15-day initial trial for the home, you also offer a 15-day trial for the cell phone. And personally, I have lots of sensitivities to just being on the cell phone. My fingers tend to go numb. I tend to get headaches. I just feel icky inside if I'm on there for too long during the day. And I found it really curious that the trial that you offered was for the cell phone. And Monica, your assistant, also said that she, since charging or boosting her cell phone, it holds on to her cell phone and keeps it by her side. How does that work? Like, I recognize that your intention behind the technology is a beneficial one. So once the FLFE is interacting with the cell phone, what actually happens that it mitigates the EMF?
So what we discovered were two ways to mitigate EMFs when we started seeing this consciousness lowering effect, just kind of life, draining instead of life affirming. So one is, if we discovered if you raise the level of consciousness of the device itself, there is some different interaction with those antennas, right? It's broadcasting energy and frequencies, that there's a harmonization that occurs where it's either smoothing out the wave in a way that it's not disturbing to the body, or somehow there's a carrier wave that's disappearing. And so just by this phone going to, say, 600 on the Hawkins map, which is what we do, it goes to the highest level. Like a 5G phone needs to be 600 or higher. 4G would be maybe 580 or 590. So just that has the phone feel better. So it's a high consciousness object now. Its emissions are harmonized in that way. But the second thing we do is bring the energetic essence of shungite into the field. And the energetic essence of shungite is only materials that we have found that harmonizes EMFs or has them become positive or beneficial rather than negative. But you just have to trust yourself. If you try it and see how it feels, it's our mantra that we have to trust ourselves. And that's why we give all the tools to turn it on and off, and turn the EMF mitigation on and off in the control panel. So you can just experiment and see how you feel.
Well, even if people, for practitioners that are listening that incorporate different types of testing, check it with muscle testing with applied kinesiology, check it with pendulum if you use it like that. I mean, you can check it in different ways to see how your body reacts to things from a very subtle energetic perspective.
What are your goals for FLFE, and what is your ultimate mission in creating New Earth?
Well, the mission is to support the evolution of consciousness in an economized society. So we added economized society onto the end of that because the evolution of consciousness for a person living a monastic life in a traditional monastery is different than those of us who have mortgages to pay and all these other responsibilities. So there is an economization to society that is I think overall it's helping. We'll see what we create as an economy as we move forward, but that's the formal mission statement. In terms of the goals, I mean, I'll speak for myself. I'm holding the intention that the world gets over that next level, Teo, over that 250 level, and get to experience what that looks like, and that there's more. I mean, there's probably, I don't know if Dr. Hawkins' work is going to be well known enough in the world that we would have an over 250 celebration on the planet. But I will go to it in my local town if there is one. So that's
for and hang out with you guys when that happens.
yeah. Let's do that.
We'll have a party.
So, I mean, that's kind of a pragmatic goal, and I tend to think in pragmatic terms these days. I don't know if it's age or just having a business and lots of employees and responsibilities. And, we're kind of numbers people. We like to geek out on data, and I have more and more, I have a reverence for truth, just because there seems to be a real battle between truth and falsehood in the world. And as you mentioned, Jason, in the world of science, how can science say whatever? How can science say these two different things or these three different things? So, yeah, that's a good question, Tay. I mean, the mission feels pretty clear. The goals, I mean, 250 is the one that comes to mind, but I think I'll hand it over to you, Jeff.
Yeah, the way I see it is rising in consciousness will solve our problems. For us to live in harmony and live in harmony with nature and create this new world of living in that way and living with each other in harmony, and creating new and amazing ways to solve the problems, of electrical energy and gravitation and all of these other things. That the higher we rise in consciousness, it seems the more that we can collaborate in a way that includes higher intelligences and higher, you could say, a higher power, that the thinning of the veil, and we have lots of discussion with Dr. Gary Schwartz about the veil and his work with the soul phone and with mediums, that there is a greater reality that we're part of, and in higher consciousness we seem to be able to not only have a higher viewpoint, we're further up the tree, we're including more in what we see, but that there's greater intelligence that can help us to create this new world, this new way of living. So my goal with FLFE is, along with Clayton's, is to see the world rise and to see individuals be supported to rise to their capacity, to really, really flower into who they are really, stripping away a lot of their old beliefs and patterns and I'm not good enoughs, to really flower. And so I love that individual evolution that we see in our community, where people are growing and changing. So I would love to see that spread throughout the world and have individuals make a difference, not only with their families and their workplace, but radiate that higher consciousness throughout the world and lift all the boats.
Well, that's kind of
Yeah, yeah.
actually at the heart of it anyways. I remember many times at lectures with Dr. Hawkins, and he would say the world doesn't actually need you to do anything to the world. The world's a perfect example of the level of consciousness of the planet. So if we want something to change, then ultimately it's us choosing to change ourselves, and then that is going to be a direct reflection of that. So I feel like that's the times we're in. We're being we're all kind of being pushed, I think, to make bigger steps than I think maybe a lot of times we have in the past. And it's through those, by each individual out there, I think, reprioritizing these things too. I know even for us, like these past several years have been big restructuring, big reprioritizing of just what's important. And, I think that also comes when you have kids. Sometimes that pops up in a little bit more, because you're thinking longer term and more what you want the world to be like for them. But yeah, I think that's just, if we don't like what we see, or we want to see something different, how do we play an active role in that participation? That's the idea, a collaborative mission, everybody doing their part. And I love that we've got innovative, really fascinating technologies to assist humanity to, sometimes just give more resilience, give more buffer, to deal with things in a different way, to see the world anew, ultimately. Guys, where can people learn more about the work that you're doing? What links can we have on the bottom for people to check out your stuff?
Yeah, I believe you have should be some links along the talk. I know you're going to be posting those. And we have a Fields of Consciousness podcast as well. So where we talk about thought forms and the influence of consciousness fields. So that's on all the platforms, Fields of Consciousness.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So there will be a link at the bottom of this video, and you can click on that. And on the website, you'll have the opportunity to have a 15-day free trial to try it out. There's no credit cards required, so just try it out and see for yourself how things feel, and how your interactions might be affected within that time period.
Guys, thank you so much. All of those links will be in the show notes as well for the podcast part of this, and also on YouTube. Guys, that was an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.